Okay, good morning, brothers and sisters. Welcome to the second session of our Saturday morning Sperry Symposium. We're so glad all of you could make it this morning. We are so pleased to have Richard O. Cowan as our speaker this session. After receiving his PhD in history at Stanford University, Richard O. Cowan joined the religion faculty at Brigham Young University in 1961. 4 years later, he was honored as BYU's Professor of the Year, and over the years has received other honors for his teaching and research. After teaching for 53 years, he retired in 2014. He has authored about a dozen books and numerous articles in the area of Latter-day Saint history and theology. He is particularly interested in Latter-day Saint temples and developed a class at BYU on that subject. His most recent publication is Provost's Two Temples. He was called to chair the committee which wrote the history and selected the other items to be placed in the cornerstone of the Provo City Center Temple, dedicated earlier this year. An active member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, he currently serves as his stake's patriarch. He and his wife, Dawn Houghton, are the parents of 6 children. Brother Cowan.
Good morning. It's a privilege to be here, and especially at the Sperry Symposium. It was my opportunity during the first 10 years of my service as a member of the faculty to be a colleague of Brother Sidney B. Sperry. So I guess I'm one of the few at the Sperry Symposium that had the great privilege of knowing him and serving with him. Well, our topic, as you can see, is what is a temple? And I don't know if you notice my tie, you know that temples is a subject that I am interested in. And I do trust that the prayer that was offered earlier this morning will be answered. That is, that the Lord's Spirit will be with us as we treat this very significant subject. Well, let's begin with a statement by Elder James E. Talmage in his oft-quoted House of the Lord. He indicated that the people in different ages haven't always had the same level of understanding concerning temples. And it's interesting to see how the temple buildings themselves reflect the level of understanding that the people have had. And so that will be our procedure today, to just see how that applies to the latter days. Now, in ancient times, temples filled 2 basic functions. A general function, they were thought of as places of revelation. You know, from the earliest time, people have felt the need to find a place where they could get away from the world and think about eternal things. And temples were such a place. Either a temple building or often in early times mountaintops were the places where they went. Just like astronomers today find an elevated location to place their observatories so they would be less obstructed by surrounding mountains or buildings or whatever. Ancients thought of the temple as the best place to observe the heavens and the ways of the Lord. Another thing about comparison with today's astronomers, often, well, just take BYU as an example. Over here is the Eyring Science Center with an observatory on top. However, that isn't the main active observatory for the university, but it's down on South Mountain, further away from the city lights. In other words, what astronomers call light pollution is a problem, and getting away from that enables them to see the heavens better. Well, you can think of the temple as a place where we get away from worldly pollution and where we can feel close to the Lord and sense His Spirit. So that is a main function of temples from the beginning. A second function in ancient times was that they were places where sacred ordinances were performed. Now, both of these functions needed to be restored in the dispensation of the fullness of time, and they have been. And what we will see today is how that restoration didn't occur all at once. Last night, we heard Brother Millett talk about how restoration has come piecemeal, and I noticed that Brother Baugh said the same thing about Adamondiaman, and it's certainly true of the understanding of temples, that the saints have not always had the same level of understanding. If you had asked a Latter-day Saint in Kirtland what is a temple, they might give a different answer than, say, the Latter-day Saints today would give. They would have the same idea that it's a sacred place where you come close to the Lord. But in terms of the function of the building, that has unfolded. And we will see how the facilities in the temples reflect these different levels of understanding. Well, our story begins in the latter days with the Lord's revelation. We know it as Doctrine and Covenants 88, where he directed the building of a house for the school of the prophets and for the saints to worship, which the Lord described the house as a house of faith and learning and glory and order and so on, but nothing said about ordinances. In other words, function number one, the temple as a place for sacred ordinances, wasn't restored at Kirtland. It came later on, as we'll see. Now, the saints also were told that only those who were worthy were to enter the solemn assemblies. So the idea of only worthy people going into this house is something that certainly still characterizes our service in the temples. And so we can see some antecedents to our understanding of temples in these instructions concerning the solemn assemblies. That's what the Lord called them, the meetings of the school of the prophets. But more specific instruction concerning temples came in June of 1833. We know it as section 95, in which the Lord gave those more detailed directions. He indicated that he would endow his people with power from on high. Now, when we attend the temple today, we ought to be thinking about how are we receiving God's power. And even though we think of performing ordinances, let's not lose sight of this very basic blessing that can come to us in the temples, that is, this endowment of God's power. Now, specifically, if all is well, you see verses, section 95, verses 13 and following. Is that okay? Yep. Good. The Lord said that the temple wouldn't be built after a pattern of the world, but after a pattern that he would reveal. And he specifically suggested that the building should have what he called the lower part of the inner court. These are language words that we may not readily understand, but the main body of the temple was called the inner court. The outer court would have been the foyer area where the stairs between the different floors were. But the lower part of the inner court, in other words, the main hall on the ground level, was to be used for preaching, prayer, and the sacrament. In other words, it was basically the Kirtland chapel. The upper part of the inner court was to be used for instruction. And the Lord specifically promised that he would reveal the design of this building to three whom the brethren would appoint. Well, the three that they appointed were the newly constituted First Presidency. And Frederick G. Williams later testified of the rather dramatic way that the Lord fulfilled that promise. That is, on one occasion, when the presidency had gathered on the site where the temple would be built, they saw a vision of the temple. And as they viewed it, they seemed to be able to see it from all sides. And then the temple just seemed to come and move over them. So they were now inside and they could see the interior of the temple. And Brother Williams later testified that the Kirtland temple in which he was speaking matched that vision that he and the others of the First Presidency had seen on that occasion. Well, the Kirtland temple was built according to that pattern, two large meeting halls, one above the other. Now, during this same month, June of 1833, Joseph drew up his well-known plat for the city of Zion. And for our purposes, notice that in the middle of the city were to be located 24 temples. And, you know, people often wonder why 24 temples in just 2 blocks. Wouldn't it be better to spread them around a little bit? Well, as the prophet described the function of these temples, some for administrative purposes, others for communicating, and so on, it was obvious that he was speaking of the word temple in the broader sense, number one, a place of revelation. And only some of those 24 buildings would be, as we would think of the temple in the more specific ordinance sense. And a later revelation, August of 1833, we notice Doctrine and Covenants 94, indicated that at the center of Kirtland there would be a complex of sacred buildings as well. Only 3 were identified: the temple, and a building for the First Presidency, and the building for printing. I just remember an experience that we in the church history and doctrine faculty had a few years ago. We went to Salt Lake City on one of our regional study experiences, and we visited the church administration building where the First Presidency and 12 have their offices, and think, well, that may be the modern counterpart of the building for the work of the presidency. And then on another day, we visited the church's printing plant where not only manuals and the ensign and so on, but even our scriptures are printed. So the modern counterpart of the building for printing. Well, the Lord envisioned those functions even for Kirtland. Well, the outside of the Kirtland temple looked pretty much like any New England chapel of the time. Typically, they had 2 rows of windows. Normally, the lower row of windows on a New England chapel would be for the main floor, and the upper row of windows would be for the balcony. In the Kirtland temple, on the other hand, they were for those 2 main halls that we've talked about. So the unique feature of the Kirtland temple was its interior. Instead of having just 1 pulpit, there were 24. Interestingly, the designations of these 24 pulpits corresponded to the descriptions of the 24 temples that we talked about in the city of Zion. And I think the idea of 24 pulpits was a teaching device. Let's take a look at them. At the west end of the main hall were the pulpits for the Melchizedek priesthood. Now, this is the area where, as we'll see in just a few minutes, a week after the dedication of the temple, I should say, that the divine messengers came and restored keys of authority. Now, perhaps you can see letters on these pulpits. They identified the priesthood officers that would occupy each level. The lowest level had the initials PEM, Presidency of the Elders and the Melchizedek priesthood. And then the next level up for the high priests, then the 12, and finally the First Presidency. And so seeing who sat where would help those early saints understand the relative authority of these different priesthood leaders. Just like today, when we think of the seniority among the Quorum of the 12, we just think, well, who sits next to whom? And that helps us understand that sequence. Now, at the east end of the hall were the pulpits for the Aaronic priesthood. And as you look at it, the second level up had PTA. That didn't mean what it does today, but it was presidency of the teachers in the Aaronic priesthood. The bottom level had PDA, and that certainly didn't have the meaning that some associate with that today, but it's for the deacons. Well, as we say, that was a means to help those early saints learn the relative placing of these officers, Aaronic priesthood on one end and Melchizedek on the other. Well, as the temple was completed and approaching its dedication, the saints enjoyed a spiritual outpouring. It's been called a Pentecostal season in the history of the church. Now, in the first, I guess might say official meeting in the temple is 2 months before it was dedicated, and the building wasn't completed yet, but the upper level is where Joseph and others met, and on that occasion, he received the vision of the celestial kingdom. We know as section 137 of the Doctrine and Covenants, in which he was shown that even those who die without the opportunity of hearing the gospel may be heirs of the celestial kingdom. Now, see, on that occasion, nothing was said about authority, nothing said about ordinances for the dead, but that is the doctrinal basis of the service that we perform, the vicarious service in temples. The fact that those our ancestors who died without the blessing of hearing the gospel may still be heirs to exaltation. Now, a week after the temple dedication, as we said, is when some rather remarkable experiences took place. The Savior himself appeared and accepted the temple. Now, by the way, this was Easter Sunday, and what better evidence for the resurrection could you ask for than the glorious appearance of the Savior himself? Also, 3 ancient prophets, Moses, Elias, and Elijah, appeared, and of course we talk about the keys that Elijah restored, turning the hearts of the fathers to the children, as being the authority for this vicarious service that is so important in the temples. And interestingly, within just a few years of 1836, when this took place, the first family history organizations were established in the United States as well as in Britain. And so we talk about this as evidence of the spirit of Elijah, the impact of the keys that he restored being manifested. Now, I got ahead of myself. We need to talk about the dedication of the dedicatory prayer. Do we have verse 5 up there? Yes. Okay. Notice how in this verse, the first main function of temples is reflected, and that is the temple was to be a place of revelation. Still, nothing said about ordinances. Then in later verses, the prophet petitioned that the temple might be a place where we would feel the Lord's glory and his spirit. Now, of course, that's what we hope to feel every time we go to the temple now. And that petition that those who would leave the temple would do so armed with testimony and with back to? Back. Yeah. Now, I just say about the dedicatory prayer, something that might be interesting to note, and that is that the prayer was given by revelation. We know it as Doctrine and Covenants, section 109, and it was then read during the dedicatory service. And I think the reason for that was so it could be the same in each of the dedicatory services. And at Kirtland, there were two. There was the one on Sunday, March 27th, then another one the following Thursday for those who couldn't be admitted the first time. And see, that's still the pattern today, that our temple dedicatory prayers they tend to be more involved, longer, and they are prepared ahead of time by inspiration. And I find it interesting to compare the temple dedicatory prayers of today, see what's being emphasized, what the Lord presses his prophet to stress, and compare it with the prayer in section 109 at Kirtland. Well, now let's see. Do we have a painting? Okay. Illustrating what happened a week after the dedication, and that is that the Savior himself accepted the temple, and those other prophets restored keys of authority. Well, in summary, concerning the Kirtland temple, we can see that it was a building consisting mostly of those two large meeting halls that we've talked about for general purposes. No facilities specifically adapted for ordinances. In other words, as we said, the restoration of temple service came piecemeal, and function number 2 just hadn't been restored yet. Well, after the problems that arose, let me just say that after the wonderful, glorious experiences associated with the dedication of the Kirtland Temple, it seemed that the powers of darkness were unleashed, and the following year, 1837, was just the opposite, a time of darkness and apostasy. And early in 1838, the prophet and other faithful saints had to actually flee from Kirtland for their safety. And he and they joined the saints who were already in Missouri, who at this time were congregating in an area of northern Missouri known as Far West. And there, another revelation, section 115, was given, directing the construction of another temple. Section 115, you see that the Lord promised he would reveal the design of the temple, and he also indicated it was to be a place where they would go and worship. Nothing said about ordinances. Well, now, before the next temple, the Nauvoo temple, was built, some rather important restorations occurred, and that is in the early 1840s. At Nauvoo, you can see baptisms for the dead were instituted. The endowment, as we know it as an ordinance, was first given. Sealings for eternity. In other words, function number 2 was given. Now, let's see if we have section 124. Good. You notice how the Lord reflected both functions of temples as he gave his instructions concerning building this temple, that it was to be a place where he might reveal himself, as well as a place where ordinances such as baptisms for the dead belonged. Well, the resulting building was similar to the Kirtland Temple, but not identical. You see, it still had the 2 big meeting halls, but now in the basement there was a font where baptisms were to be performed, and then in the attic under the gabled roof, other facilities where other temple ordinances, well, specifically the endowment and sealings, took place. More about that in just a minute. But see, this the revelation that we saw a moment ago, section 124, was given in January of 1841, and by November of that same year, they had the basement sufficiently completed. The font was built and enclosed with a temporary frame structure to shield it from the outside elements. And so baptisms for the dead were inaugurated there. And the prophet Joseph personally participated performing baptisms, and others of the top church leaders did the same. It just reflected how important those ordinances were. Well, the Nauvoo temple was built through great sacrifice, great effort of the people. And they understood also that this building was designed by revelation. Now, if all goes well, you're seeing a picture of the temple. Okay. Maybe you remember the experience that William Weeks had. What happened is Joseph received the revelation about the temple, but then he invited different people with architectural skills to present their specific ideas as to how the temple could be designed. And he had chosen the plan that William Weeks presented. Well, Brother Weeks suggested that it would be inappropriate to have round windows on the side, the long side of the building. That just wasn't according to architectural style. But Joseph said, I've seen this building in vision, and having those windows illuminated at night, I guess with a candle in each window, gave quite a grand appearance. And he said, that's the way the temple should be built. Now, if you remember, I'm going to try something really dangerous here. Does this take us back to the cross sections? Okay, you can see that the two big halls had arched ceilings, and there are little rooms on each side of that arch, and that's where those round windows would be, into these series of small rooms along the outside of those arches. Back to the outside view. Okay, so the point we wanted to make is that there is inspiration in the designing of the temple. I guess primarily in the facilities that it was to include, but even in this case, you see the architectural style. Well, as the prophet neared the end of his earthly ministry, he felt an urgency to promote the saints' temple activity. And even after his death, the temple construction pushed forward. And as different parts of the temple were completed, they were dedicated. Not the whole temple, but an individual area. Now, this was particularly true of the attic story, dedicated in December of 1845. And it was there that the temple ordinances other than baptisms took place. They, of course, were in the font in the basement. But the original design of the attic was to have a long, narrow room, which was called the council chamber. Well, that room, the saints divided with temporary partitions into different areas, representing the different stages of our eternal progress. And as the endowment instruction unfolded, they moved from one area to the other, from area representing the creation and the garden and the celestial world and the terrestrial and so on, and eventually reaching the eastern end, which had a beautiful Gothic window and was beautifully furnished as best they could to represent the celestial heaven. And so that was the use that the top level of the Nauvoo temple was given to. And then along each side were 6 rooms on each side, which were to be offices. But some of them had altars in them, and so doubled as ceiling rooms. So we can just say in summary that the Nauvoo temple, similar to the Kirtland, but with the addition of facilities in the lowest and the highest levels for ordinances. Now, the idea that the temple was more than just for building or for meetings may have been reflected in the words that were used to represent or refer to the temple. In Kirtland, it was usually referred to as the Lord's house, whereas in Nauvoo, the building was more commonly referred to as the temple. So just the shift from the use of house to temple reflected that. Now, interestingly, even though the saints had that understanding, apparently they weren't completely aware of how the temple should be used. And during those last hectic weeks before the Exodus, there are records of how some even went into the upper of those two assembly rooms that wasn't completely finished yet, and had parties or dances or something, and it was just getting in the way of the temple ordinances. Well, can you imagine the endowment being given on that upper level and partying going on just below? It just didn't work. And Heber C. Kimball, who was in charge of the work in the temple at that point, instituted a practice of restricting admission to those who had official business, namely to go there for ordinances. And this might be the beginning of our practice of temple recommends. And I thought you just might be interested in seeing how that has unfolded. That, of course, the Revelation said the temple should be entered only by those who are worthy. We've commented on that. And then the restrictions at Nauvoo. But in the early pioneer period here in Utah, the practice was for the bishop of the ward to send a list to the nearby temple of those in the ward who were worthy to go there and do ordinances. And such a list was sent every 6 months. And so when you would go to the temple, you would identify yourself. You'd have some kind of ID, but then they'd have a list that your bishop had sent, and if you're on the list, you could be admitted to perform the ordinances. Well, that worked fine when people weren't traveling very much. But as more temples were built and as automobiles came along in the early 20th century, there's a need for the individual to carry something with him to maybe a temple other than the nearest one. And so the concept of temple recommends came into use. And originally, and I can still remember this, that we received recommends in triplicate, and they were given for a specific temple. In other words, if we were going on a family trip and said, well, we're going to visit the St. George, the Manti, and the Salt Lake temples, and we would need to get recommends for each of those temples. And the triplicate meant that the bishop would keep one copy, we would take two, one of which we could leave with the temple that they could have on file, I guess something like the list that had been sent by bishops in earlier times, and then we could keep the third copy for ourselves as a means to identify ourselves if we were to return to that temple later on. Well, in the 1960s, I guess the decision was made, if you're worthy to go to one temple, you're worthy to go to any temple. And so the current practice of just a simple temple recommend that we carry with us came into use. So just a little sidelight there. Well, after the exodus from Nauvoo, I should mention before we leave Nauvoo that the endowment was received in that upper area of the temple by about 5,000 people. And on February the 3rd, 1846, a group had gone to the temple for their endowment. I imagine people signed up ahead of time for the date that they would go. And they probably counted down those dates, just like we count the days until some important event is going to happen. And on February the 3rd, the group had come to the temple, and President Young met them there and said, brothers and sisters, our enemies are going to cut us off. We need to get out of here while we still can. And he said, we can build temples in the mountains, and you can receive your blessings there. But I propose that we go home this morning, get our wagons ready, and get ready to leave. Well, you can imagine how you would feel if this is the day you were going to receive your temple blessings. And now President Young is saying, when we get to the mountains, maybe a few years from now, we'll have a temple there, and so on. Well, in other words, they looked forward to having temples, and the blessings of those who had received the endowment helped carry them through the Exodus experience, crossing the plains. Well, within days, in fact, within 2 days of the time that the main body of pioneers arrived in the Salt Lake Valley, President Young was walking through what is now Temple Square and was impressed that this would be the place for the temple. And he had his cane with him. He put it down and said, "Here we will build the temple to our Lord." And Wilford Woodruff had the presence of mind to find a little stick and pound it into the ground to mark that spot. And it eventually became the center of the Salt Lake Temple. And President Young later said that it was on that occasion, 1847, that he had a vision of what the temple would look like. And he described how it would have 6 towers, 3 at one end representing the Melchizedek priesthood, and 3 at the other end representing the Aaronic. And then in 1854, when construction was just barely getting underway, the architect, Truman O. Angell, described what the temple would look like. And his description is pretty detailed. And the exterior description he even gives dimensions of the towers and so on, is pretty much exactly the way the temple is. But the interior, though, you can see followed very closely the pattern of the Kirtland and Nauvoo temples, the 2 large meeting halls. Well, it would take 40 years to build the temple, and ordinances had to be performed, and they were performed different places. Maybe you've heard how Addison Pratt received his endowment on Ensign Peak, and others, well, as I've done my own family history, my earliest Cowan ancestors came to the Salt Lake Valley in 1850, and my great-great-grandfather received his endowment in the president's office in 1851. And none of those were really satisfactory. They needed to have a place that was secluded. See, the president's office or the council house were used for other purposes. So they needed a place apart. So the resulting building, we call it the Endowment House, completed in 1855, anticipated what temples would later become. It consisted of a series of rooms representing the different stages in our eternal progress. They had murals on the wall depicting the garden and this world and so forth. And so you could just say in summary, the Endowment House was built pretty much exclusively for temple ordinances. Well, as Brigham Young neared the end of his life, he felt the same urgency that Joseph had to promote the saints' temple activity. And one of our faculty members here, Brother Richard Bennett, has done extensive work in studying the unfolding of temple consciousness that came as a result of the activities and teachings of President Brigham Young. Well, specifically, the St. George Temple was completed and dedicated just a few months before President Young died in 1877. Now, interestingly, this is the place where endowments for the dead were instituted for the first time. President Bruce Hafen, who one time was vice president here on campus, but then became one of the general authorities, and then more recently served as president of the St. George Temple, has pointed out that 3 temples were needed for the complete restoration of temple service. As we've seen, the authority was given in Kirtland, the ordinances came in Nauvoo, and then the filling out of work for the dead came at St. George. See, there were baptisms for the dead in Nauvoo, but only endowments for the living. But endowments and sealings for the dead were more completely instituted at St. George. And initially, the plan was to have the ordinances take place in the basement area. In other words, the architect and Brigham Young himself felt that they just didn't feel comfortable departing too much from the pattern that had been established in Kirtland and Nauvoo. And so instead of going back to the pattern of the endowment house, they went back a quarter century to, Truman O. Angel's original cross-section of the Salt Lake Temple. And so that's how the St. George Temple went into service. The endowment and sealings, particularly the endowment, took place in that basement area. But it was obvious almost from the outset that the number of people coming to receive those temple blessings just overwhelmed the facilities available in that basement area. So President Young himself gave permission to use the lower of the 2 main assembly rooms at St. George for giving the endowment. So it was obvious that there had to be more adequate facilities for that ordinance provided. And Brigham Young said that there would be variations in temple design. He said just as a family, say a husband that is building a home for a large family might have to have more accommodation than, say, when he and his wife are first married, so would be the case with the temples. And so he anticipated variations. Well, the next 2 temples planned were Manti and Logan. And the planning of these 2 temples started under the direction of President Young, and the architects provided basically the entire lower half of the building for ordinance purposes. Only the upper of those 2 large meeting halls was retained. And during this same period of time, the Salt Lake Temple was nearing completion. Now, this is interesting to me. I've seen plans for the Salt Lake Temple dated 1885. Now, see, the temple was started in 1853 and completed in 1893. So in 1885, they were approaching the end of that 40-year construction period. Well, the outside of the temple the walls were pretty well completed, but they were still planning the interior. In fact, the interior as we know it today wasn't completely decided on until about 1889. So compare the cross-section of the temple that we had seen in 1854 with the way it was finally completed. You see, once again, the lower half of the building, roughly speaking, was now designed for the ordinances, the endowment and sealings. The baptismal font was in the basement, as you know. And being at church headquarters, facilities were provided for administrative function, a floor for the general authorities. I guess the most significant room on that floor is the council room of the First Presidency and the 12. Now, if you were here in the auditorium last hour, we heard the discussion about the brethren as prophets, seers, and revelators receiving revelation to guide the church. And more significant revelations might have been received in this place than in any other location. You see the semicircle of seats for the 12, and the 12 are invited to speak freely as matters are being considered. Now I'm thinking of a couple of examples. 1952, a discussion took place there concerning whether or not temples should be built abroad. And the decision was, yes, we need to provide temple blessings to the saints worldwide. And then, of course, in 1978, the revelation that we heard reference to in other presentations on extending priesthood blessings to all races. Again, that experience took place in this council room. So I guess in summary, we could say that the Salt Lake Temple now retained that upper assembly room, which is used occasionally, but it has facilities for the brethren, and the part of the building that we know the most is the lower half, which is used for ordinance purposes. So I think it's interesting to see that we can see that both functions of temples, that is, a temple is a place of revelation, a temple is a place for ordinances, apply. Not just to the brethren receiving revelations in the Salt Lake Temple, but we, as we go to the temple, may receive and should receive revelation concerning our own lives, our own stewardships. Well, since that time, I guess the main development of temples has been, you might say, some, refining. The first two temples built in the 20th century, Hawaii and Alberta, did not retain that large assembly room. The brethren said that doesn't have to be in all temples. You might know that only two temples during the 20th century did have it, the Los Angeles and the Washington, D.C. So you can see that temples have come, you might say, full circle from Kirtland, from a building designed almost exclusively for general meetings to temples designed almost exclusively for the more specific purpose of temples, ordinance work. Well, some of these tweakings that we mentioned that have taken place, as the church spread worldwide, we needed to provide ordinances in different languages. And we mentioned in 1952 the decision made in that special room in the Salt Lake Temple to build temples abroad. President McKay said we would build smaller temples so there could be more of them closer to the people. Sounds like President Hinckley, doesn't it? But anyway, the Swiss temple was the first of those, and the concept of using films, which meant that the temple ordinances could, the endowment specifically, could be presented in different languages with a smaller number of ordinance workers. And in just one room rather than a series of rooms made it possible for temple blessings to be offered overseas. And then later temples, the Oakland Temple had two ordinance rooms rather than just the one. But now the Ogden and Provo temples in the 1970s went to a design where there could be 6 presentations going on at once. And you may know that endowments in the Provo temple still begin every 20 minutes. So if you miss one, you don't have to wait. And then in conclusion, as the church has really exploded worldwide, President Hinckley received the inspiration to build smaller temples. President Hinckley went to Colonia Juarez to help celebrate the centennial of a church school there. And he was impressed with the faithful saints in that small settlement and thought, how can we provide temple blessings for them? At that time, they had to cross the international border to Mesa to receive their blessings. And he received the inspiration of the much smaller temples. And I don't know if we have a picture of that or not, but that was the place where that inspiration came, and about 70 of those smaller temples were built worldwide. Well, interestingly, in conclusion, the Provo Temple was temple number 15 in the church. The Provo City Center Temple was temple number 150. tenfold increase, representing the worldwide explosion of temple building. So now, what a blessing it is to have temples close to most members of the church. And I hope that we have caught the idea that the Lord has guided the saints in understanding more fully the function of temples, and we've seen how the facilities have been provided for those. We still may go individually to the temple and receive inspiration, revelation for our own needs. May the Lord bless us to take advantage of these opportunities, is my prayer in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.